Hello, everybody. I'm Rene Ramos, director of the Lynn and Louis Wolfson II Florida Moving Image Archives, and this is Rewind, the show that looks back on Florida's past with historic film and video. It's time for another trip back into the past, so sit back, relax, and enjoy another episode of Rewind.
This is Al Dempsey in Recife, Brazil, and back of me is the pirated luxury cruise ship Santa Maria. It's discharging its 588 passengers, including 42 Americans, who were supposed to arrive in Port Everglades 11 days ago. The episode is unlike anything in nautical history. Pirate Captain Enrique Garbon has surpassed anything accomplished by former nautical bandits. Morgan, Petit, Blackbeard, none of them were able to accomplish what has been done by Garbon. The passengers have also been witnesses to an event that has shocked the entire world.
And then all of the passengers of all classes had congregated right at that area, and they were screaming, and the children were crying and hysterical, and it was a very, very tense situation. What the worst of the whole experience we've had.
Mr. Crockett, do you plan any cruises in the near future?
No, I'm staying at home for quite a while.
WTVJ's cameras have been covering the event since it began. Here now is the epic of the Santa Maria.
WTVJ News Department presents a special report on the hijacked liner. Story of the Santa Maria. Your host for this special telecast is Chase Federal Savings and Loan Association, who invites you to save where thousands save, and say as thousands say, for my money, it's Chase Federal.
It was on January 24th that word was flashed around the world that a huge luxury liner had been hijacked on the open seas. America's race for space with Russia suddenly took a back seat, as did other major news events: Laos, the Congo, integration, unemployment. Civilization was thrust back some 300 years to the time when pirates roamed the Spanish Main. The modern-day Santa Maria, a name already familiar to us since grade school when we learned of Columbus discovering America, captured the interest and imagination of the world as she sailed her uncertain course. We remember the Main. The Titanic will not be forgotten, and so will the story of the Santa Maria live on forever. This is the route the Santa Maria was accustomed to taking on her voyages to ports on 3 continents. She was scheduled to dock at Port Everglades almost at the same time that word was received she was no longer in Portuguese hands. Instantly, the ships and planes of 3 nations began searching the waters of the Caribbean and South Atlantic. These were the same areas where pirates of long ago terrorized shipping. But despite the utilization of modern traffic tracking devices, the Navy reported in all frankness it was stumped. The United States probably lost the ship's location publicly to avoid a sticky point of international law. The Santa Maria, 610 feet long, 78 feet wide, weighing 22,000 tons, had eluded all detection. But as the search continued, information began filtering in concerning the ship's fantastic seizure by insurgents. A band of 28 rebels boarded the vessel as passengers at La Guaira, Venezuela. Hours later, they suddenly produced an arsenal of weapons, killed one of the ship's officers, wounded several others, and then took over. They put the injured men off at St. Lucia in the Windward Islands, turned the vessel around, and began heading toward Africa. The rebels proclaimed themselves an occupation force, said that they were revolting against the government of Portuguese Premier Salazar. The search went on. Finally, the Santa Maria was spotted from the air. A Navy Hurricane Hunter plane, nearly out of gas, sighted the ship as it crossed the equator northeast of Belém, Brazil. A Danish freighter also sighted the ship. And then came a series of radio phone contacts between rebel captain Enrique Galvão and Navy officials. Galvão was talked out of his African cruise, persuaded to sail for Recife, Brazil, with a promise of political asylum. Now that the Santa Maria was located and heading for port, the job of recording its story was just beginning for WTVJ newsman Al Dempsey and scores of other reporters from across the country who were in Recife. What was it like, Al, in that city?
Well, the main thing was that it was hot. It's just around the equator, and the working conditions, the humidity were pretty miserable, added to the tension and the working long hours, working around the clock almost. There was no real word of what this ship was going to do.
How many newsmen, Al, were down there?
Oh, I'd say there were 150 to 200 newsmen from all over the world, from Australia, Canada, England, France, and the United States was well represented.
Well, you have just returned from Brazil with the first motion pictures to be aired on U.S. television of the passengers disembarking from the Santa Maria and interviews with the passengers. Now, this actually happened on Thursday. Why is it that no other television station or network in the country has been able to air these films before this time?
Well, the fact that Recife is a major seaport in South America does not mean that it's a major airport. There is very little air traffic in and out of Recife. Some of the organizations have had to ship film from Recife to Rio to Dakar, Africa, to Lisbon, Portugal, then into London, and finally into New York. Even these films are getting lost. The conditions are hazardous, and now the snowstorm in New York finally added the coup d'etat to the whole thing. They just aren't getting their film in.
They had to close the airports in New York. Al, what would you say was the one prime objective in your covering of this story?
Well, without reservation, I can say that the one dream, it was almost an obsession, was to get onto the Santa Maria. Our attempts were made in a very clandestine manner. 4 other newsmen and I met on a lonely beach about 10 miles north of Recife. We carried a $30 supply of food. The story had caused a minor inflation in Recife. We also carried some rum to keep us warm against the ocean spray and wind. The departure was in secret because Captain Jesus Maria Alvarez said the Brazilian Navy was stopping attempts at boarding the Santa Maria. Local fishermen began charging ridiculous prices for their services once they realized how important it was for newsmen to get on the captive cruise ship. The skipper's family turned out to wish bon voyage, and they well might have, because the fee that he was receiving was more than a year's pay. Top price paid was $1,500 for a 6-hour trip. Bill Stapleton, the photographer and writer from the Miami Herald, and United Press International writer Andy Taylor were on board. The pilot of our boat was a real sailor. He used an old Navy surplus compass, for it was mounted in a cigar box. He stood at the helm without relief for 14 hours. There was a universal feeling of sickness among the passengers, and by morning there was also the sad realization that we were going to fail in our attempts. We spotted the Santa Maria one time during the evening, but we were no match for her 20-knot speed. We were chugging along at about 4 knots an hour. The skipper estimated that we traveled out into the sea about 50 miles. It was quite an experience, and the ocean jaunts became so frequent that the Recife Regatta was organized by some of the most eager and most frustrated men you've ever seen covering a news story. There were also plenty of sunburned foreheads from the equator's sun.
Thank you, Al. The Santa Maria docks and the passengers tell their stories after this time out for Chase Federal. The Santa Maria, easily one of the biggest news stories of this century. And yet, with the ship almost in sight of Brazil, the military men of Brazil threw up an unexpected obstacle in the path of newsmen. Tension mounted, along with speculation, as the days wore on. Newsmen from the United States became short-tempered when heavily armed Brazilian Marines ordered them away from the docks, where it was rumored the Santa Maria would tie up. The Brazilian newsmen moved out without question, but the Americans argued and angled every inch of the way. Needless to say, the men with the tear gas, submachine guns, and automatic rifles won hands down or guns up, depending on the way you look at it. Actually, the entire area was under a type of martial law. There were triple roadblocks leading to the dock area, and newsmen had to show identification papers to prove they had a right to approach. CBS cameraman nearly got in trouble when he had to retrieve his sound gear. The soldiers were friendly but firm in their movements. The United States Navy commander intervened, and the next day newsmen were allowed into the dock area, but still under guard. While the reporters were having their difficulties at Recife, the Santa Maria was now sailing and escorted by 3 American and 2 Brazilian warships. Still only a promise and very much uncertain at the time was the question of whether or not the Brazilian government would allow the rebels to keep the liner after the captive passengers were freed. On this U.S. destroyer, the Navy men were relieved upon seeing smiles on the faces of those passengers as they waved their greetings from afar. There had been many reports telling of a water shortage aboard the Santa Maria. It was also feared that the passengers may have been mistreated. But though there was rationing, the water supply never ran out, and the passengers themselves said the treatment was as good as it could be under the conditions. Captain Galvan, in fact, had done away with passenger restrictions during the first day that he took power. That's the Captain Galvan on the right. His classless system continued for several days, with third-class passengers taking advantage of facilities usually reserved for only the high-paying customers. But Galvan had to yield to the many complaints of the first-class patrons. He reversed his ruling, and the short term of luxury liner socialism came to an abrupt halt. The passengers were all very frightened at first, but then got used to the unusual situation. None of them attempted to escape because, as one man put it, where could we go? There was only the ocean around us. As the Santa Maria came into sight of land, dropping anchor about 3 miles from shore, crowds began gathering. Vantage points became premium locations, and one truck driver was charging about 20 cents per seat on top of his cab. There are about 500,000 people in Recife, and most of them were interested in the Santa Maria. Newsman Dempsey asked one local vendor his impressions of the whole situation. The man, known only as Joe, said it was a boon to business. He was making about 10 days' pay for each day's work. This is carnival time in Brazil. Preparations for the Mardi Gras are in full swing, and the festivities are being complemented by the Santa Maria incident. Soldiers, with their guns still in hand to keep everything in line, they were missing the fun of the carnival. Interest was so widespread that local television stations, there are 2 in Recife, began doing live remote broadcasts from nearly every point of attention, which ranged from the dock to official buildings downtown. In one of the official buildings, Admiral Diaz Fernandes held the first Brazilian Navy news conference on the Santa Maria situation. The Admiral is commander of the 3rd Naval District in Recife. He told newsmen that Captain Galvan had demanded the right to put into port, take on fuel, water, and supplies. In exchange for this, Galvan said he would disembark the passengers and crew, accepting those necessary to run the ship. The Admiral delivered his message, then halted the conference. He said he would not answer questions. It would take too much time. He did say that our Navy was free to discharge the 42 Americans on board. U.S. Admiral Smith earlier in the day said that would be impossible. Well, after all those days of waiting, how did you feel now that the ship and the passengers were finally coming in?
Well, actually, none of the newsmen actually believed that the ship was coming in at this time. It was just too much to fathom. We had waited. We had been ready time after time. They said the ship was coming in, and then so we'd say that the ship was going to stay out at anchor. The news corps, after constant alerts, was pretty frustrated about the whole thing. And so we just went down preparing for it, but not expecting it to actually come in. There was rumor the night before that the ship was going to take off for Africa. Some of the men even went as far as to get plane reservations to Dakar so that they could head it off in the eventuality that it went.
Incidentally, how do you pronounce in Portuguese the name of the ship captain?
Galvão. There is, in the Portuguese language, there is a French connotation and an inflection, and some German, a guttural sound. And Galvão is said in the United States as Galvão.
Galvão. We'll stick with that. Thanks, Al. Now let's get back to the film. The moment was finally here, and the eyes of the world focused on the Brazilian city of Recife, which suddenly became as common in our vocabulary as the city of Brooklyn is. Santa Maria steamed slowly and majestically past the long breakwater and toward the piers. An ambulance was moved into position just in case it was needed. People rushed through the tropical city to the waterfront and the beach areas to watch the liner come into view. Signal flags fluttered from her rigging. Cameras were clicking everywhere. This was it, a joyous moment for the passengers who saw a tropical cruise turn into one of the oddest adventures of the century. A group of skin divers man a speedboat and head out toward that ship. Their job, to help the passengers down the gangway and into the tugboats.
Mrs. Preston, were you mistreated at all?
No, we weren't mistreated. Treated well. Except we didn't have enough water for laundry.
Was there any restrictions on food or anything?
Not for us.
First
class was treated very well.
Then the dramatic moment when the Brazilian Navy tugboats began moving people to the dock. Cheers and applause from the crowds greeted the passengers as soon as they came near the Recife pier. 188 passengers on that first tug. They carried only the possessions they could hold in their hands. This was one of the restrictions placed on them by the Navy in order to ensure a rapid transfer. Little children gazed in wonder at all that was going on. Photographers had a field day. This was the first time the Santa Maria's passengers could really relax. One woman on that tug told newsman Dempsey she was afraid the rebels might do something to halt the transfer. She didn't want to act as an alarmist, but she said she was really scared. Actually, there was little reason to fear any stoppage. The Brazilian Marines had disarmed the rebels and were controlling the whole operation. Newsmen shouted questions to the people. In return, they received names and addresses and requests such as, "Tell our family we're all right." Some passengers were amazed to see the newsmen on the docks. They said they didn't realize the story was important enough to warrant all this attention. At long last, the first of the captive passengers set foot on dry land again. Many had written diaries of their experiences and were eager to sell them to anyone, all apparently at a price. Others freely volunteered information to newsmen. At any rate, all were quite eager to talk about it. One man who came ashore said he believed Galvão thought a revolution was underway in Portugal when he seized the vessel. The 42 Americans were all in good physical shape, but Brazilian health officials said a group of penniless Spanish immigrants being returned to Spain were very weak. The Portuguese Athletic Club in Recife organized a staging area for the ship's passengers until accommodations could be found.
They've been brought here to the Portugal Club outside of Recife. Mr. and Mrs. Crockett from Pompano are here. They were among the 42 passengers on board. Mr. Crockett, what was your first impression of the piracy?
Well, I didn't believe it at first. I couldn't believe it. I just thought maybe it was mutiny. But my wife said, no, they must have taken the ship over.
What gave you that impression, Mrs. Crockett?
Well, they wouldn't be their characters, but where they were guns. Didn't look like anybody from the ship. What the ship would put guns in their hands. Just didn't look like it.
What were the physical conditions on the ship after the crews took over?
Well, they were pretty good. They kept it up. We had enough food. They started rationing the water and also the food.
Was there air conditioning?
No, that had broke down already before.
Did they keep the bar open?
Yes. I had plenty to drink. Champagne. Champagne every day.
What were the various names that the passengers gave the Santa Maria during your pirated cruise?
We named it the Flying Dutchman. And since yesterday we named it Santa Mañana.
Why did you call it the Santa Mañana?
Because it was always mañana. We didn't get up.
Every day.
For days already was tomorrow you get up, and we didn't. So we named it Santa Mañana.
We've been on this thing since the 9th of January.
Newsman Dempsey spoke next with Mrs. John Dietz of Pompano, Florida, wife of a retired University of Florida professor. She said she and her husband were just taking a restful vacation.
Mrs. Dietz, what was your most memorable moment on this piracy?
I think today, when the crew and the tourist class passengers were rioting and screaming and yelling, when the admiral of the Brazilian Navy, wasn't that he who wrote it, when he came, they just went wild, happy for liberation. And then they tried to break their way into the lounge, and they pushed so forward that they pushed one of the, what shall we call them? These bad men. Well, they pushed him through the
We've been calling them pirates. I don't know.
I call them buzzers, and some of them call them goons. And we have all sorts of names for them. But anyway, they pushed him right through a heavy glass door that leads into the lounge. The glass splintered and fell into pieces, and all the passengers around there ran, and the children screamed, and it was a terrific scene for a few minutes.
What are your impressions of the Captain Galvon?
Well, he was a very gracious gentleman to us. Very.
In what way was he gracious?
Well, he would favor us with requests. For instance, I asked him if he would provide a shuffleboard coach for us on A deck, since we were not privileged to go to the first deck after the Revolution. And so he had some of the seamen come up and paint a very nice coach for us. And then later said, well, this ship is rented, madame. Oh, yes, he was very gracious. It sounds so crazy. It doesn't make sense, you know.
That's only one part of the story. We'll be back with the rest of the story after this time out for Chase Federal.
After the passengers were safely off the Santa Maria, the ship's captain met with the newsmen. Mario Mayas looked dejected at the conference. He was angry about the whole incident. He said he was most anxious to regain his command. Earlier in the day, Galvon called Captain Mayas a coward. The captain pointed out that his crew had only their hands to fight against machine guns. He said he was off the bridge at the time of the takeover. He said his first mate was on the bridge at that early hour. It was about 1:30 in the morning. The rebels entered the wheelhouse and said they were taking over the ship. The mate, Third Officer Antonio Jose de Costa, tried to alarm the crew to save the ship, and he was shot 3 times and killed. 5 other crewmen were injured by gunfire. The pirates altered course from a heading that would have taken them to Florida and Fort Everglades. The captain noticed the change in course and called the bridge. A strange voice had answered. The captain asked, "Who is this?" The voice from the bridge came back, "Who is this?" and hung up. Captain Mayas moved for the bridge, but he was stopped, arrested, taken prisoner aboard his own ship. He was confined to his cabin. About 2 hours later, the rebel leader, Galvon, came to the cabin, informed him the ship was no longer his. He had several meetings with Galvon. He said the rebel was polite, but also said he looked crazy. He said the pirate had a strange look in his eyes and a manner that was unnatural for a normal man. But the rebel captain's plans were changed. He was told by Brazilian authorities that he'd be granted political asylum, but that he would have to surrender the Santa Maria. He did surrender the ship in a ceremony on board the liner. Then Galvan and his men were put ashore at Recife, while newsmen were jostled again by Brazilian Marines. The government of Brazil returned the Santa Maria to her owners, and Galvan said he'd continue his fight to unseat dictator Salazar, this time from land bases and not at sea. An agent of the owners warns that Galvan hasn't heard the last of his escapade. The agent says charges of murder and robbery will be filed against Galvan and his crew in any nation where the courts have jurisdiction over the case. Galvan willingly posed for photographs. It's apparent he accomplished at least part of his objective. He got plenty of publicity. The story isn't over yet. 42 American passengers have been given $320 apiece by the Santa Maria's owners for transportation to this country. 30 of those passengers will arrive in Miami aboard a Real Airlines plane sometime early Tuesday morning. The other 12 have made no travel arrangements thus far. It's Mardi Gras time in Rio. Perhaps they feel in need of a little celebrating. Congratulations to you, Al Dempsey, for that fine report on the Santa Maria at Recife and for bringing us the first airing in this country of pictures of the disembarking of the passengers and interviews with the passengers. That's the fantastic story of a 20th century adventure on the high seas, the hijacked liner.
The Hijacked Liner. Story of the Santa Maria has been brought to you by Chase Federal Savings and Loan Association with 5 convenient offices to serve you. Why don't you join the thousands who say, for my money, it's Chase Federal. This special program was produced by WTVJ News. Cameraman reporter Al Dempsey. Writer Fred Moot. Film editor Joe Martinez. Narrator Ralph Rene. Director Marty Saxon. Your Chase Federal announcer is Noah Tyler.
That's about it for this edition of Rewind. Just time to remind you that Rewind features historical film and video from the Lynn and Lewis Wolfson II Florida Moving Image Archives. To see more from the Wolfson Archives collections, visit our website, wolfsonarchives.org. You can search the archives catalog and watch video online. And be sure to connect to our YouTube channel, where you will find hundreds of carefully curated clips, or link to the Wolfson Archives Facebook page to keep up with our busy calendar of historical happenings. Until next time, I'm Rene Ramos. Thanks for watching.